Hello students, this is the first lecture. This is on the various forms of government. Now you took a little time and you watched the presentation, the YouTube presentation on how to do Cornell notes, so we're going to give it a try right now. And we're just going to do the best we can. There's no pressure. And when you're done, we're going to do some comparing and contrasting. We're going to see how we did in comparison to our classmates. Okay. Here we go, people. There are two essential questions in this presentation. The first one is on what are the various forms of government, the basic forms of government here in the world. And in those forms of government, who ultimately calls the shots? Who's in charge? So those are the two essential questions that are going to guide us throughout this presentation. I'm going to go through just some brief definitions of each one of the forms of government, and then I'll give you some examples. Now, the very first form of government that we're going to talk about today is oligarchy. In an oligarchy, a small group of people has all the power. You know, oligarchy in Greek means ruled by a few. Now, there's not a lot of countries that are openly an oligarchy. But what an oligarchy means that there's like a small group of powerful, rich people who kind of control politicians. Or it might mean like a communist government where there's a small group of leaders who kind of run the show. Oftentimes there's what's called a junta, which is that's spelled J-U-N-T-A. Which is a small group of people, usually military officers, who rule a country after taking it over by force. So it could mean like wealthy business people who control politicians. It could mean like a communist country where there's a small group of leaders who call the shots. Or it can be like a junta, where there's a small group of military leaders who run the country. Our next form of government is something called a theocracy. Now, judging by the flag there, that's an interesting flag. This flag was actually the Prohibition flag in the United States in 1915. Prohibition was a time period right after World War I when it was illegal to manufacture and sell alcohol in the United States. And much of the impetus or much of the drive to create this situation was a religious one. So the leader of the Prohibition movement created this flag as a symbol to show that they are Christians, they're Americans, and they want to get rid of the sale and manufacture of alcohol. Now, a theocracy, what a theocracy means is that a theocracy is a government that recognizes God or a divine being as the ultimate authority. Theo is the Greek word that means God. In a theocracy, religious law is used to settle disputes and rule the people. Now, the majority of Americans are Christians, and Christians read the Old and the New Testament, and the closest thing we have to a set of rules in the Old Testament would be the Ten Commandments. Could you imagine if the Ten Commandments were enforced by police officers? Imagine if think about the Ten Commandments, committing adultery or taking the Lord's name in vain or working on Sundays. Imagine if those were laws that were enforced by police. Wouldn't that be interesting? And something else, there are some theocracies in the world. Saudi Arabia would be a theocracy. Iran would be a theocracy. Now these are Islamic countries, but those would be examples of theocracies. Our next form of government is anarchy. In anarchy, nobody's in control, or everyone is, depending on how you look at it. Sometimes the word anarchy is used to refer to an out-of-control mob. When it comes to government, anarchy would be one way to describe a human state of existence before any government's developed. Now, a lot of people look at anarchy and say, well, that sounds like a lot of freedom. But you need to think about it for a few minutes. If there are no rules, then you could be attacked by anyone. So anarchy is fine for the biggest, strongest person in the world because they can do whatever the heck they want. But if you're like me, who's not the biggest, strongest person in the world, you're probably going to be Running for your life in anarchy. It's kind of the rule of the jungle where you're always looking around for the next predator to eat you. Now, there's no examples of anarchy in the world today because no government and anarchy don't go together. They're mutually exclusive. Okay, monarchy. Well, monarchy is something that a lot of people get. It means there's a king or a queen rules the country. The king or queen is known as a monarch. Monarchs usually come to power through their family line. The current king or queen's oldest child becomes the next king or queen. In some monarchies, especially those in historic times, the monarchy held all the power and had the final say. That's what's called an absolute monarchy. But what's happened over the last 200 or 300 years, thanks to the Enlightenment, which we'll study next, is monarchs' powers have been limited by legislatures and constitutions. So most monarchies that exist today are constitutional monarchies. A good example would be the United Kingdom. There's a lady called Queen Elizabeth who rules, technically, the United Kingdom, but she doesn't have much power. Power really rests in the hands of Parliament and the Prime Minister. So absolute monarchs are pretty much a thing of the past, although some would say that Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy and a theocracy. But most monarchies that are around today are constitutional monarchies. They're limited. Okay, dictatorship. A dictatorship is a government in which one person has all the power. There are two main types of dictatorship. One is monarchy, which we talked about before, and the other is dictatorship like Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, where they say you jump and your response is how high. They hold all the cards. And you know, there are some dictatorships in the world today. Probably the best example would be North Korea with the bizarre Kim Jong-un, whose very word can mean life and death. Now you might be interested to see what this picture is. This picture is of Julius Caesar, who was one of history's most famous dictators. He became the dictator in Rome, and he was assassinated because people in Rome did not want a dictator. And last but not least, we have democracy. In a democracy, citizens hold the political power. There are two fundamental types of democracies. There's representative democracy like we have in the United States. In other words, we have members of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. We elect those people to go to Washington and make decisions on our behalf. You know, we're not there voting on the floor of the Senate, on the floor of the House of Representatives. There's someone that we've elected that is doing that on our behalf. So that's a representative democracy like we have here in the United States. Another form of democracy is direct democracy. In a direct democracy, there are no representatives. Citizens are directly involved in the day-to-day working of governing the country. Now, it's kind of hard to imagine. There's no countries in the world where there's an example of this. There are some countries where citizens have more say, but there's no country that's a direct democracy. Okay, people, those are the systems of government. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to meet with your classmates and see if you can compare the information that you pulled out with the information they pulled out. Hopefully there's some similarities.